They say time heals. But what about a dog who never stops waiting? In a quiet town where the wind still whispers her name, a golden retriever lies beside the small white coffin of the only soul he has ever loved. A little girl with chestnut hair and a laugh like spring rain. He doesn't understand death, but he does understand love. And love tells him not to leave. This is the story of a heart that beats in silence and a bond that even goodbyes can't break. The sky above Willow Creek, Oregon, wore a shawl of quiet gray, as if nature itself paused in reverence. It was early spring, yet the air still held a winter's chill. The streets were damp from the morning drizzle, and the scent of pine and wet earth lingered in the wind. Clouds loomed heavy over the small cemetery on the hillside, where old oaks stood like solemn guardians watching over the grief-stricken gathering below. Among the mourners stood Sarah, a lean woman in her late 50s with shoulder-length silver hair pinned back under a black hat. Her posture was rigid, her face tight with a sorrow that had worn grooves into her features over the years. Once a schoolteacher, Sarah had grown colder after losing her husband a decade ago, and now she gripped a tissue not just for tears, but for balance. Beside her, a teenage boy named Carter, Ellie's cousin, shuffled awkwardly in a too-large jacket. He was lanky, red-haired, and wide-eyed, clinging to a drawing Ellie had given him last Christmas. His silence was not the silence of mourning, it was the silence of disbelief. The focus of the ceremony, however, was the small white casket resting on an altar surrounded by white lilies. Inside it lay Ellie Carter, 8 years old, with soft chestnut hair curled around her face like a halo. She wore a pale pink dress with lace around the collar and a dainty bracelet on her wrist. Plastic beads spelling Bailey the name of her best friend in the world. Her expression was peaceful, but too still, as if sleep had taken her too deeply to return. At the back of the crowd sat a man in his early 40s. Tall and broad-shouldered with grizzled black hair and a beard trimmed with just enough care to hide its wildness. This was Jake Carter, Ellie's uncle, a retired Marine who had spent the past 2 years isolated in his cabin up the hill, nursing the ghosts of battles overseas and one personal war he could never win: his sister's slow death and his failure to connect with the bright-eyed girl she left behind. Jake hadn't planned to come to the funeral, but something he wouldn't call it guilt. Maybe obligation had pulled him down from the woods that morning. The priest's voice wavered as he read the final prayer, and in that moment of heavy silence, a rustling from the back startled everyone. A golden blur shot through the legs of mourners. Gasps rippled across the crowd as the dog appeared: Bailey, the 3-year-old golden retriever who had been Ellie's shadow since she was 5. His fur, a rich honey gold, was damp and tangled from running in the rain. His brown eyes searched wildly until they found the casket. "No Bailey," someone cried. Perhaps the funeral director, a short man named Howard with a comb-over and permanent scowl. But no one moved fast enough. Bailey jumped onto the low platform with a surprising grace, planting his paws gently beside the coffin. His head-lowered nose touching Ellie's small hand, and then he lay down beside her, pressing his body to the casket as if trying to warm her back to life. He did not whimper, did not bark. He simply stayed, mute and resolute. Tears broke anew among the mourners, even those who had been composed before. Sarah turned away, her shoulders shaking, while Carter dropped the drawing, letting it flutter into a puddle. Jake's eyes narrowed. He hadn't seen the dog since the accident. Seeing Bailey like this, so still, so certain, pierced something beneath his carefully guarded grief. Bailey had been Ellie's constant. When the doctors discovered the congenital heart defect, it was Bailey who slept under her hospital bed, who licked away her tears when medications made her sick, who laid across her legs during long, lonely afternoons when her classmates forgot she existed. He had been her laughter when the world gave her silence. No one had the heart to remove him. The ceremony faded into soft murmurs as the priest nodded, closing his book with trembling hands. People began to leave, casting glances back at the dog who refused to say goodbye. That night, the funeral home director Howard locked up as usual, shaking his head and muttering about protocol. But he couldn't bring himself to drag Bailey out. One night he told himself, glancing once more at the animal curled up beside the coffin. Just one night. Outside, the storm rolled in fully. Rain lashed the windows. Wind moaned through cracks in the walls like voices of the lost. But inside the chapel remained still. A dim emergency light cast a pale glow over the room. Bailey never stirred. Only once did he raise his head to nudge his nose closer to Ellie's fingers, then lay back down, his breath, shallow ears twitching to the rhythm of distant thunder. Jake stood in the shadows by the door. He hadn't meant to stay. He told himself he'd only stop by just to make sure everything was as it should be. But something in him refused to leave. The sight of Bailey, so loyal in the storm, so broken yet steadfast, felt like a reflection of a truth Jake had buried. Deep loyalty wasn't just for the living. It was for those who had shaped your heart and then slipped away, leaving echoes you couldn't silence. He didn't speak, just leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching Bailey breathe. And for the first time since the doctor's call, since the ambulance's wail, since the child-shaped hole tore through his world, Jake cried. Not the rage-fueled tears of a soldier, or the shameful ones of a broken man. Just tears. Quiet, honest. Cleansing. Bailey never looked up, but something in the tilt of his ears, in the gentle wag of his tail, even as sleep took him, said he knew Jake was there. And for that night, in a world that felt colder than ever, warmth returned. Just a flicker. But enough. The rain fell in steady sheets over Willow Creek as twilight surrendered to night. The small funeral chapel at the edge of the cemetery glowed dimly against the storm's grayness, its arched windows blurred with rivulets of water. Inside, the warmth of the space clashed with the chill, creeping into the bones of everyone still present. Bailey lay curled beside the white casket, unmoving, save for the slow rhythm of his breath and the occasional twitch of an ear as thunder grumbled above. Several attempts had been made to coax him away. The first was from Howard, the funeral director, whose thin patience was fraying. "This isn't protocol," he muttered again, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he stood at the edge of the sanctuary cote, still damp from the rain. His wife, Marion, a petite woman with neatly combed auburn hair and a sympathetic gaze, rested a gentle hand on his arm. "Howard," she whispered, "let him be. He's grieving, same as the rest of us." She looked at Bailey and shook her head. Maybe more than most. Bailey didn't respond to Howard's firm claps or soft whistles. He didn't flinch when a blanket was placed near him, nor when a small bowl of water was gently slid within reach. He remained head resting against the white wood of the casket, eyes closed, the tip of his nose touching the edge, as if in silent communion. When the last of the mourners left, Howard locked the chapel and stood just beyond the door under his umbrella. Rain struck the concrete like tapping fingers. Marion leaned into him. "You did the right thing," she said. Howard, who'd buried hundreds, perhaps thousands of people, never quite believed in signs or spirits. But tonight, something about that dog made him uncertain. Meanwhile, Jake Carter hadn't gone home. Instead, he sat in his truck parked across the street from the chapel wipers, barely keeping up with the rain. He hadn't moved for an hour, his large hands resting on the steering wheel, forehead pressed against it. His breath fogged the window, blurring the light of the chapel across the rain-slicked street. Inside Jake's mind, memories stirred like ghosts underwater. Ellie's laughter, sharp and bird-like, echoing in his sister's old house, her feet thumping across the floorboards when she'd run with Bailey. The way she once climbed into his lap, uninvited, and asked Uncle Jake, do soldiers ever cry, and how he'd lied to her. No, sweet pea. Soldiers don't cry. But soldiers do. And uncles. And men who feel they failed the only bit of joy that had reached them since returning from war. The storm deepened. Thunder cracked open the sky, and a bolt of lightning painted the woods behind the cemetery with a momentary silver light. Jake finally stepped out of the truck, pulling his coat tighter. He walked across the street, boots splashing in puddles, shoulders hunched against the wind. Instead of knocking, he cupped his hand to the chapel window and peered inside. Bailey hadn't moved. Jake stared at the dog, the unwavering loyalty in that golden frame. There was something sacred in that silence. Not religious, but reverent. Jake turned back to the truck, but he didn't climb in. He retrieved an old Army-issue blanket from the back seat, frayed at the edges, still holding the faint scent of field gear and rain. Instead of going home, he walked to the side of the chapel and found the maintenance door unlocked. The storm had loosened the latch. Inside, the air was hushed. The only sound came from Bailey's breathing and the ticking of the antique wall clock near the back. Jake approached slowly, stopping a few feet from the dog. He crouched, set the blanket down nearby, and sat. "I know," Jake whispered. "You don't want to leave her." Bailey stirred at the voice, not opening his eyes, but his tail tapped once against the floor. Jake's throat tightened. I didn't either. He stayed there cross-legged, watching the dog sleep. Minutes passed, then an hour. Jake leaned against a pew leg, stretched out, mind-wandering. Somewhere between memories and the present, his body gave in. He drifted into shallow sleep, the storm's howl fading into the hush of grief shared between man and dog. Morning came soft and blue. The rain had passed, leaving puddles on the cemetery grass that shimmered like tiny mirrors. The first light crept into the chapel through stained glass windows, casting soft colors across the floor. Bailey was awake before Jake. The dog sat quietly, ears alert, eyes fixed on the casket. When Jake stirred, Bailey walked to him, slowly sat down beside him, and pressed his head gently against the man's shoulder. Jake, blinking against the ache in his back, looked at him. "I guess we both lost something we weren't ready to lose." Jake reached out and ran his hand through Bailey's matted fur. It was damp and smelled faintly of lilies and old tears. Bailey leaned into the touch, his breath warm against Jake's wrist. In that moment, the former soldier saw not just a grieving animal, but a soul as lost as his own. The front door creaked open. It was Marion, holding a cup of coffee in each hand. Her floral scarf fluttered in the morning breeze. "I figured you two might need something warm," she said with a gentle smile. Jake stood slowly and took the coffee. "Thanks. I didn't mean to stay." "You weren't alone," she said, nodding at Bailey. Neither was he. Jake looked at Bailey again. The dog stood now alert, not anxious, but waiting, as if he'd decided something during the night. "He's not going to want to leave her," Jake said. Marion nodded. "Then maybe take him home for a while, until he's ready." Jake hesitated, then knelt to Bailey's level. "You want to come with me, boy?" Bailey didn't wag, didn't bark, but he stepped forward close enough for Jake to clip the leash still attached to his collar. He followed quietly as Jake led him outside. The sun broke through the last of the clouds, and for the first time in weeks, Jake tilted his face up to feel it. They stood in silence, two broken hearts, and one silent promise to find meaning again. Together. The house on Timberline Road had been quiet for too long. Once it echoed with Ellie's laughter, the soft clatter of her crayons on wood floors, and the muffled thump of Bailey's paws chasing her shadow down the hall. Now it was a hollow place. Dust clung to picture frames, the air smelled of pine-scented cleaner and unspoken memories, and each room held the echo of someone who had left too soon. Jake Carter stood at the door holding it open as Bailey padded cautiously across the threshold. The golden retriever sniffed the edge of the welcome mat, hesitated, then stepped inside. His coat had dried from the night before, though tufts of fur still curled at the edges. Jake closed the door behind them, the latch clicking louder than expected in the stillness. Jake, now 44, was a man carved from weather and war. His once black hair had turned salt and pepper at the temples, his skin toughened by sun and time. Though he had a broad, square frame built by military service, it was his eyes that betrayed the wear of years. Gray sharp, but carrying the weight of silence. He wore a plain flannel shirt tucked into worn jeans and heavy boots that made the wooden floor groan beneath him. He watched Bailey move slowly through the hallway. The dog's nose skimmed the baseboards, his head-low ears turned slightly back. When he reached the foot of the stairs, he stopped and stared up at the second floor. Then he walked to the door on the left, Ellie's room, and sat, tail sweeping once across the floor before curling beside him. He didn't scratch or bark. He just sat, waiting. Jake stood behind him, arms crossed, then turned away without a word. He walked into the kitchen, flicked the coffee machine on, and leaned against the counter. The house had belonged to his sister before she passed Ellie's mother, and now, after her and Ellie's deaths, it was his by default. But it never felt like it belonged to him. It felt like a museum of a life he'd never learned how to be part of. By evening, Bailey had not moved from the doorway. Jake brought him a bowl of water and a dish of leftover roast chicken, placing it quietly beside the dog. Bailey didn't eat at first. He just stared at the door. When Jake returned an hour later, the food was gone, but Bailey had returned to his seated vigil. That night, Jake slept on the recliner in the living room, a half-finished glass of whiskey sweating on the side table. He dreamt of desert sand explosions and a child's voice calling him back, always out of reach. At 3:17 a.m., he woke to the sound of low whimpering. He rose quietly and followed the sound to Ellie's door. There Bailey lay curled tight nose against the frame, eyes half open and glazed with longing. Jake crouched down, ran a hand along his side. "She's not in there, buddy," he murmured. "She's not anywhere anymore." Bailey whined softly and closed his eyes again. The next morning, Jake called the local rescue shelter. A woman named Lila answered. She had a warm voice and introduced herself as the coordinator. She explained that they had space, but she hesitated when Jake mentioned the dog's attachment to a lost child. "Sometimes," she said gently, "they grieve like we do. Some even more." Jake hung up without leaving a firm answer. Days passed. Each night, Bailey returned to Ellie's door. Each night, Jake would find himself sitting beside him, sometimes with a coffee in hand, sometimes in silence. He began talking to Bailey, to himself, to Ellie. He told stories of his sister when they were kids, about the time she broke her arm falling out of the oak tree in their yard, or when she snuck Jake cookies before he left for boot camp. Bailey listened. Sometimes he shifted his head to lay it on Jake's leg. Sometimes he stared at the crack beneath the door, as if Ellie might reappear through it. One afternoon, Jake stepped into the backyard with Bailey trailing behind him. The grass had overgrown and the garden beds were untamed, but Bailey immediately bounded to a weathered patch of earth where Ellie had once planted daisies. He sniffed, then laid down in the middle of the forgotten garden tail, thumping once. Jake stood watching, arms folded. He exhaled slowly and said, "I guess you remember more than I do." That evening, a new visitor arrived, Sarah, Ellie's former teacher. She was tall, slender, with silver-streaked auburn hair pinned back neatly. Dressed in a pale blue cardigan and dark jeans, she carried a small bundle wrapped in tissue paper. "I didn't want to intrude," she said softly when Jake opened the door. "But I found this in the classroom cubby." Ellie must have forgotten it. Inside the tissue was a drawing, Ellie and Bailey standing under a rainbow. The words, "Me and my best friend," were scrawled across the top in purple crayon. Jake's voice caught. "Thank you," he managed. Sarah looked past him into the living room where Bailey now lay near the fireplace. "He hasn't left her side, has he?" "Not for a minute," Jake said. "It's like he thinks if he waits long enough, she'll come back." She touched his arm lightly. "Maybe he's waiting for you to come back too." That night, Jake sat on the floor beside Bailey again. The dog had eaten better, and his tail wagged faintly when Jake entered. Jake held the drawing in one hand, a beer in the other. "I'm not good at this," he admitted. "People. Feeling things. But maybe you and I can be broken together until we're not." Bailey leaned against him, eyes half closed. And for the first time, Jake didn't look at the door. He looked at Bailey. The rain had finally ceased over Willow Creek. The morning sun filtered gently through the curtains of the living room, casting soft patterns across the hardwood floor. Dust motes floated lazily in the light. The house, though still hushed with grief, had begun to breathe again, softly, slowly, like an old wound testing the strength of its scar. Jake Carter stood at the base of the stairs, a cardboard box tucked under one arm, his other hand gripping the banister. The attic hadn't been touched in years, not since Ellie's mother, his sister Rachel, had passed. He had gone up that morning to find old blankets and stumbled across a trunk covered in a faded pink sheet. Inside were remnants of Ellie's childhood stuffed animals, outgrown shoes, crayon-scrawled art, and at the bottom a wooden music box etched with tiny stars and moons. The box was worn at the corners, its lacquer dulled by time and tiny fingers. Jake descended the stairs and brought it into the living room where Bailey lay stretched beside the couch tail, thumping once as Jake entered. Jake sat cross-legged on the rug, set the music box in front of him, and opened the lid. The melody that trickled out was gentle and slightly off-tune, the ballerina inside twirling on a metal pin. Jake hadn't heard it since Ellie was alive. She used to wind it up every night before bed, the tune echoing down the hall. But this time, it wasn't just the music inside. There, tucked beneath the dancer, was a small notebook bound in red, felt its pages filled with a child's rounded handwriting and dotted with stickers. The first page read in thick purple marker letters for Bailey. Jake's breath caught. He flipped the pages slowly, careful not to smudge the ink. Each entry was a note from Ellie to her dog, some silly, some heartbreakingly tender. Dear Bailey. One began. Today I threw up again, and Mommy cried. But you sat by the bathroom door. That made it better. Another read, Bailey. If I go away first, don't be sad. I'll wait for you somewhere with cookies. Jake bowed his head, tears slipping freely now. Years of bottled sorrow cracked open all at once. He pressed his forehead to the notebook, not speaking, just breathing with effort. Across from him, Bailey rose and crossed the room with quiet steps. The golden dog lowered himself beside Jake, resting his head gently on the man's thigh. His warm breath and quiet presence said everything words could not. That afternoon, as Jake continued reading through Ellie's letters, the doorbell rang. He blinked, set the notebook down, and stood to answer it. On the porch stood a woman in her 70s with a weathered face and kind gray eyes. She wore a thick cardigan over a floral blouse and loose khaki pants, and her silver hair was gathered into a messy bun that escaped in wisps around her temples. She held a basket filled with folded towels and cleaning supplies. "Hi, Jake," she said, smiling gently. "It's Margaret, from next door." Jake stared at her for a moment, confused. "Margaret. Right. You knew Rachel." "I did." "And Ellie." Her eyes flicked toward the house's interior. "I thought I'd drop by. Figured you could use a little help around here." Jake stepped aside. "Honestly, I haven't cleaned much since—" "You don't have to explain," she said, entering without waiting for permission. "That's why I brought vinegar and towels." Grief doesn't care about dust bunnies, but mold does. Margaret moved through the house like someone walking through a memory. She paused occasionally to glance at a photograph or straighten a picture frame. She didn't speak much as she worked, just hummed an old tune under her breath, one Jake couldn't name but somehow recognized. He followed her into the kitchen, watching as she opened cabinets and set to wiping down shelves. "You were a nurse, weren't you?" he asked. She nodded, her motions fluid. 32 years. Retired 5 years ago. But I've learned grief doesn't care about retirement either." Jake leaned on the counter. "You do this for everyone." "Only those who don't ask," she replied, not unkindly. "Sometimes it's the quiet ones who need the most." Bailey wandered into the kitchen, sniffing at Margaret's basket. She smiled, kneeling to scratch behind his ears. "There's my sweet boy. Still watching over your soldier, huh?" Jake chuckled softly. He hasn't left my side. Not once. As the day passed, Margaret helped Jake sort through boxes, tossing old papers, reorganizing closets and folding away the past with hands that knew when to be gentle. She found Ellie's school ribbons, Jake's medals, a family recipe book annotated in Rachel's handwriting. They laughed once when she found a baby photo of Jake in a sailor costume, and cried once when she held a stuffed giraffe Ellie had slept with every night. When the sun dipped behind the pines outside, Jake offered her a cup of tea. They sat in the living room, Bailey curled between them. Margaret looked around the room, eyes lingering on the photo of Ellie and Bailey on the mantel. She loved deeply, Margaret said, sipping her tea. And you loved her, even if you didn't know how to say it. Jake looked down at the music box. I think Bailey always knew. He still does, she said. And now, maybe you do too. Later that night, after Margaret had gone and the house was still, Jake lit a fire in the hearth. He sat on the rug, the red notebook in his lap, Bailey beside him. He opened to a random page and read aloud. Dear Bailey, Jake doesn't smile much, but I know he likes you. If I go to heaven, can you stay with him so he won't be lonely? Jake exhaled slowly, leaned back against the couch, and stared into the flames. I'll keep my promise, Ellie, he whispered. And Bailey, with his head on Jake's foot, gave a quiet sigh, as if he'd heard every word. The days in Willow Creek grew longer as spring edged toward summer. The fields beyond Jake Carter's home had begun to turn green, and the dogwoods along the road near the post office had bloomed in clusters of soft white and pink. But inside the house on Timberline Road, change came slower measured, not in blossoms, but in breath and in quiet courage. It was a Tuesday morning when Margaret returned, this time not with vinegar and towels, but with a small stack of folded clothes and a manila folder marked Ellie. Jake met her at the door, Bailey padding close behind him, his golden coat glinting in the early light. The dog had taken to following Jake through the house, not in search of Ellie anymore, but simply to stay near him. I was going through some of the donation boxes at the school, Margaret explained, stepping into the living room. And I found this in the bottom of her art bin. No one had the heart to toss it. She handed the folder over. Inside, on thick crayon-streaked construction paper, was a drawing. A bright, childlike rendition of Ellie and Bailey standing in front of a building. A big sign above the door read, "The Ellie and Bailey Club." Stick figures of other children and dogs filled the lawn. There were balloons, flowers, and speech bubbles scribbled with phrases like, "This dog makes me feel safe," and "I love coming here." Jake stared at it. His throat tightened as his thumb traced the edges of the paper. "She never showed me this," he whispered. Sometimes, Margaret said gently, children dream of things they don't yet know how to say. He sat down heavily on the couch, Bailey placing his chin on Jake's boot. Jake looked up at Margaret. "Did she talk about this with you?" Once Margaret nodded. During a school visit, Ellie told me she wanted to build a place where other kids who were sick or lonely could come and feel better, especially with dogs like Bailey around. Jake chuckled, the sound wet in his throat. That sounds just like her. Later that afternoon, Jake drove into the heart of Willow Creek. The town center was modest, a two-lane street lined with cafes, a bookstore, a pharmacy, and the old community center that looked like it hadn't seen a coat of paint since the 1980s. He parked his truck under a maple tree and walked up the cracked sidewalk toward the brick building. Bailey trotted beside him, tail swaying lazily. Inside, the scent of mop water and dusty bulletin boards filled the air. At the front desk sat a middle-aged man with thick glasses and a receding hairline. His name tag read Daryl, Director. He looked up as the door creaked open. "Jake Cartwright," he said, standing to shake hands. "We all heard about Ellie. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thanks," Jake said quietly. "I came to ask something a little strange." Daryl tilted his head. "Go on." Jake laid the drawing on the counter. Ellie wanted to create a space for kids, especially ones struggling, where they could spend time with dogs like Bailey. "I know this place hosts programs. I was wondering if there's a room or corner I could fix up. Something small, just to honor her wish." Daryl adjusted his glasses. "You want to start a therapy dog program?" Jake hesitated. "I don't know what to call it. But yeah, something like that." Daryl leaned forward, studying the picture. "This town could use a bit more hope. And honestly, this place could use new life." We have an old reading room that no one uses. It's small, but if you're serious, I can talk to the board. I'm serious, Jake said. That evening, Jake sat on the floor of Ellie's room. He hadn't entered it properly since she passed. The air was still sweet with the faint scent of her strawberry shampoo. On the wall was a mobile of stars she'd made from construction paper and glitter glue. Bailey stepped inside behind him, circled once, then lay at the foot of the bed. Jake stared around the room. I think it's time we give her dream a real shot. Over the next few days, Jake began to visit the community center regularly. He repainted the reading room, turning its once dull walls into bright shades of green and blue. He replaced the threadbare rug with foam tiles shaped like puzzle pieces and brought in small beanbags. Bailey accompanied him each day, often sitting by the window and watching traffic pass as Jake worked. Soon Margaret arrived with stacks of children's books. Sarah, Ellie's old teacher, donated a bin of plush toys and a faded alphabet mural she had saved from her classroom's wall. Even Carter, the awkward teenage cousin, showed up one Saturday with a can of paint and a shy offer I could do the ceiling stars. Jake smiled and handed him a brush. Word spread. A retired carpenter named Roy gray-bearded and quiet-built low benches for the kids to sit on. A woman named Denise, a vet tech with dyed purple hair and a tough exterior, volunteered her 2 golden labs, Maple and Hank, who had been trained for emotional support. Every evening, Jake returned home to a tired but peaceful Bailey. They'd sit on the porch as the sky turned lavender and watch the wind sweep across the grass. One evening, Jake unfolded the drawing again and pinned it on the new bulletin board in the reading room. At the bottom, he wrote in thick black marker, "Coming soon, the Ellie and Bailey room, for healing hearts." By the time June settled into Willow Creek, the Ellie and Bailey room had become the town's quiet miracle. A small placard painted by Carter in soft pastels hung just beside the front door of the community center. Beneath the name were Ellie's own words copied from her drawing in a childlike scrawl. "This dog makes me feel safe." Inside, sunlight streamed through the wide windows in the afternoons, warming the floor where children now sat, read, and most importantly laughed. The walls were covered in art made by little hands drawings of dogs, rainbow hearts, and messages like "Thank you, Bailey," and "Dogs make bad days better." Bailey had become a fixture in the room. He was no longer just Jake's dog or Ellie's guardian, he was now a healer in golden fur. At 3 years old, Bailey carried a calm maturity that made him perfectly suited for therapy work. His expressive brown eyes held endless patience, and his movements were slow, deliberate, reassuring. The children adored him. Jake had begun training Bailey properly, not just through instinct, but with structured sessions. He reached out to Angela Torres, a retired therapy dog handler who lived just outside town. Angela was a tall woman in her late 60s, with short, curly white hair and a voice like chamomile tea, gentle but firm. She had spent most of her life working with veterans and children in hospice. When Jake first visited her property, Bailey immediately sat beside her without command. Angela raised a silver brow and smiled. "He doesn't need much training," she said. "He just needs permission to do what he was born for." Jake met with her twice a week, working on cues, gentle responses, and understanding how to manage emotional environments. Bailey adapted fast. He learned to stay still when a child hugged too tightly, to nudge gently when someone seemed sad, and to sit with quiet dignity when words were too much. Among the children who attended the center regularly was Leo Thompson, a 6-year-old boy with sandy blonde hair and large round eyes that rarely blinked. Leo had been diagnosed with selective mutism after his mother passed in a car accident 6 months earlier. His father, a mechanic named Henry, brought him every Tuesday and Thursday, but admitted that Leo hadn't spoken or smiled since the funeral. Leo didn't respond to toys or stories. He sat cross-legged in the corner, arms folded tightly, eyes darting to the door, as if always on guard. On Bailey's 3rd week at the center, the golden retriever walked past the bookshelves and sat quietly at Leo's feet. He didn't nudge or bark, just lay down, placing his head on Leo's small shoe. Leo didn't move. The next session, Bailey returned to the same spot and did it again. On the fourth visit, as the children were painting, Bailey trotted over to Leo, turned in a circle, and sat directly on the boy's lap with a thud. The room went silent. For a moment, no one breathed. Then, for the first time in months, Leo laughed. It was small, soft. A quick gasp of sound as he placed both arms around Bailey's neck. And then, like a light bulb finally flickering to life, his shoulders shook with laughter. Jake, watching from the corner, felt something shift inside him. He sat down later that night and opened a notebook Ellie had once scribbled in. He turned to a blank page and began to write. Day 1, Leo laughed when Bailey sat on him. The whole room heard it. I felt Ellie there. I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe it's just to feel closer. Maybe this is my way of still talking to her. From then on, Jake made journaling a ritual. Every evening he'd sit in Ellie's room or out on the porch, Bailey curled at his feet, and write about the children, about the room, about Bailey's quiet triumphs. He wrote to Ellie as if she were still there, reading every word, with her knees drawn to her chest, giggling at his awkward sentences. Bailey, ever attentive, would often place a paw on Jake's lap mid-sentence, as if to remind him she's still here in a way. The community responded. A local reporter named Shelley Burns, a woman in her 40s with sharp features and a warm demeanor, visited after hearing about Leo's story. She had short auburn hair, glasses that always slid down her nose, and a notebook constantly in hand. Her article in the Willow Creek Gazette was titled, "The Dog That Taught a Town to Breathe Again." It featured photos of Bailey sitting calmly beside Leo and children reading with their hands draped over his back. Jake clipped the article and pinned it on the bulletin board beneath Ellie's drawing. Bailey's fame grew. People began donating blankets, toys, snacks, even therapy books. A volunteer group of retired teachers began showing up weekly to read aloud. Sarah, Ellie's old teacher, brought in handmade flashcards and led sing-alongs. Carter began building a small bookshelf shaped like a doghouse. One morning, as Jake locked up the community center, he stood outside for a long while, keys in hand, Bailey beside him. The air was crisp with the smell of cut grass. The wind rustled the flag out front. Jake crouched down and ran his fingers through Bailey's fur. "She'd be proud of you," he said. Bailey looked up, ears perked, and licked Jake's hand once. The summer sun had mellowed into a warm gold that painted the hills of Willow Creek in soft light. It was a Thursday afternoon outdoor therapy day at the community center. Jake Carter had arranged for the sessions to move outside once a week, setting up shaded blankets and lawn chairs in the field behind the building. The children loved it. There was more air, more space, and Bailey seemed to breathe easier under open skies. That day, the usual group of children gathered beneath a cluster of oak trees. Leo, now laughing freely, was playing catch with a ball shaped like a smiling bumblebee. Bailey was in his element, padding between kids, offering his paw, lying across laps, soaking in sun and affection like a sponge. Jake, wearing his usual work boots, worn jeans, and a faded navy t-shirt, stood nearby, notebook in hand. He watched with quiet contentment, jotting notes now and then, observations for Angela, ideas for future sessions, a quote from a child here and there. The peace was interrupted by the arrival of a dark blue SUV that parked near the gravel drive. The door opened and a family stepped out. A man in his early 40s with a strong build and buzzed salt and pepper hair. A woman with soft features and careful eyes, and between them a girl. She was small, about 8 years old, wearing a sunflower yellow dress and white sandals. Her long, light brown hair was parted in the middle, cascading in gentle waves. Her skin was fair, and she had a small scar near her left eyebrow, barely visible. But it wasn't her features that froze Jake in place. It was the way Bailey reacted. Bailey, who had just returned from catching a frisbee, paused mid-step. His body tensed, ears shot forward. His tail stopped wagging. His eyes locked on the girl. Then, without warning, he ran. Children gasped, and Jake started forward, then stopped. Bailey wasn't charging, he was gliding. His stride was low-focused, like an arrow shot straight from memory. The girl stood still, her hands clenched at her sides. As Bailey reached her, he slowed, then pressed his head against her chest, whimpering once, a sound that had not been heard since Ellie's funeral. The girl dropped to her knees and hugged him. Jake reached them moments later, out of breath, but silent. The man, Tom Harrison, a firefighter from Bend, Oregon, extended his hand. "Sorry," he said, quietly. "We didn't expect this." Jake looked at the girl. "Who is she?" "She's Luna," Tom replied, glancing at his wife, Rebecca. A speech therapist with gentle posture and shoulder-length auburn hair. "She's Ellie's twin." Jake stared. "What?" "She was born early," Rebecca explained softly. "Doctors said separating them gave both girls the best chance. We were selected through the hospital's adoption program. There were complications. We were told the family preferred privacy after the placement. We respected that." Jake knelt beside Bailey and Luna. "Why are you here now?" "Luna has been struggling with emotional regulation," Tom said. "We tried everything. Our pediatrician heard about Bailey from another family. Said this place works miracles." Luna looked up. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I know him." Jake's heart stilled. Bailey was now lying beside her, head in her lap, as if she had always been his. Over the next hour, the children resumed playing, and Jake sat with the Harrisons beneath the tree line. They explained how Luna had been experiencing vivid dreams about a dog with golden fur. She'd been drawing him for weeks. Rebecca showed Jake one from her phone, an image of a girl holding hands with a golden dog under a tree. "It's like she's been searching for him," Rebecca said. Jake showed them Ellie's drawing. Luna stared at it, blinking hard. "She used to tell me stories about another girl who liked music boxes and stars," Luna whispered. "I thought I was making it up." Jake glanced at Bailey, who was now curled up beside Luna as she read to him from a picture book she'd picked off the therapy shelf. They returned the next day, and the next. Luna blended into the group as if she'd always belonged. Sarah, the teacher, noticed how she instinctively sat in the same circle spot Ellie once preferred. Carter offered her one of his hand-painted bookmarks. Even Leo, once so withdrawn, gave her a painted rock shaped like a smiley face. Jake didn't push. He let Luna come to him when she was ready. One day, Luna sat beside him while he journaled. "Were you Ellie's dad?" she asked. Jake smiled sadly. "No. I was her uncle. But I loved her very much." Luna nodded. "Bailey remembers her, doesn't he?" Jake paused. "He remembers everything." Luna leaned against his arm. "Do you think she's watching us?" Jake looked at the drawing board, at Bailey's soft breathing, and then up to the sky. "I do. And I think, she brought you back." Summer in Willow Creek had ripened into something golden. Lazy cicadas, long evenings, and the laughter of children that lingered long after the sun dipped behind the tree line. The Ellie and Bailey room had grown into more than a corner of healing. It had become a sanctuary for quiet souls. But nowhere had change bloomed more vividly than in the girl who once trembled at the threshold. Luna Harrison was no longer the silent, wide-eyed child who clung to her parents' hands. She was still small for her age, but her steps had gained rhythm. Her sunflower yellow dresses were now joined by blue ones, green ones sometimes covered in paint or cookie flour. Her once guarded gaze now carried mischief, her voice soft but steady. Every Tuesday and Friday she arrived at the community center holding a book in one hand and Bailey's leash in the other. It had become their ritual, Luna reading aloud, while Bailey rested his head on her lap, sometimes snoring gently mid-sentence. The room would often fall quiet just to listen to her read, as if the wind outside paused to hear her tiny voice carry a story. Bailey, now nearing 4, had matured into an anchor for dozens of children, but none more than Luna. His golden coat gleamed in the sunlight, his movements calm and attentive. The subtle, almost imperceptible sadness that once lingered in his eyes had faded. When Luna touched his ears, he closed his eyes in absolute trust, the way he used to when Ellie brushed his fur under the stars. Jake Carter watched this transformation like someone witnessing a second sunrise. He often sat on the wooden bench beside the center garden, built by Roy the carpenter, with a notebook in his lap and a look that held equal parts gratitude and disbelief. The idea for the book came not from ambition, but necessity. One night after Luna had curled up on a beanbag and fallen asleep with Bailey beside her, Jake sat in the reading room long after everyone had gone. The walls were covered in drawings, now Leo's handprints, Sarah's alphabet board, a new mural painted by Carter of a golden dog with wings. Jake looked at the photos on the wall, Ellie and Bailey, the first group session, the day Leo spoke Luna's first hug, and the silence around him felt full, not empty. He picked up his journal, flipped to a fresh page, and wrote 4 words: Guardian of the Last Goodbye. What began as a title became a calling. Jake wrote late into the night. He wrote about Ellie, about her short life, her silent bravery, her joy in simple things. He wrote about Bailey not as a pet, but as a companion through grief, a steady heart in a world that had stopped making sense. And he wrote about the center, how one girl's dream scribbled in crayon had become a shelter for others. When he finished months later, the manuscript was just under 200 pages. He didn't send it to a publisher. He printed 10 copies at the local print shop and handed them to people who had shaped the journey: Margaret Angela, Sarah Carter, and finally Tom and Rebecca Harrison. Rebecca cried when she read it. Tom, silent as ever, hugged Jake without a word. Luna, sitting on the porch with Bailey curled beside her, held the book to her chest. "I remember this," she whispered. "Even the parts I didn't live." Jake smiled, swallowing a lump in his throat. "Maybe some memories don't belong to just one person." As word of the book spread, Jake began receiving letters, stories from other towns, other children, other veterans. Strangers who had lost someone. Strangers who had found someone. Strangers who believed in the quiet miracles that hide in ordinary days. But for Jake, the miracle always returned to one moment. It was late September, the first night of early autumn chill. The center had closed early due to a storm warning. The town lights flickered as wind rustled the leaves, and Jake stood in the doorway of the therapy room, watching as Luna wrapped a soft, knitted blanket around Bailey's back. He watched as she sat beside him on the couch, opened a worn picture book, Ellie's favorite, and read aloud. Her voice rose and fell like music, and Bailey ever still curled his body around her legs and rested his head in her lap. When the book ended, Luna looked up and said softly, "Do you think she knows?" Jake crossed the room and crouched beside them. "I think she never left," he said. "She's just, shining through you now." Luna leaned back, eyes closing. Bailey shifted, once yawned, then nestled deeper into her side. That night, for the first time since Ellie's passing, Jake didn't dream of loss. He dreamed of stars. And in the middle of them, a golden dog running across a field toward a girl, laughing under the light. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or trumpet sound. Sometimes they come wrapped in golden fur, in quiet loyalty, in the soft heartbeat of a dog who never gave up. Bailey didn't just remember love. He carried it forward from one soul to the next until healing found its way home. And maybe that's how God works too, not always in lightning, but in silence, in presence, in the hearts that choose to stay. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us. Have you ever witnessed a quiet miracle in your life? If you believe that love never truly dies and that God still sends little messengers to walk beside us, type Amen in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so more hearts like yours can be reminded that even after goodbye, love still finds a way home. May God bless you and everyone you love.